The worst thing a father can do is not leave you without support, but leave you without permission to exist the way you choose. I still remember the exact sound of my father's voice that morning, sharp and controlled, cutting through the quiet kitchen like a verdict already decided before I even had a chance to explain myself. My name is Claire Anderson, and I was standing by the counter holding a small folder of legal adoption documents that suddenly felt heavier than anything I had ever carried before. The house in suburban Illinois was still half asleep, sunlight just beginning to stretch across the wooden floor, but the atmosphere between us was already fully awake in tension. My father, Richard Anderson, stood near the kitchen table with a posture that did not invite discussion. It was not looking at the papers in my hands. It was looking at me as if I had already made a decision that placed me outside the boundaries of what he considered acceptable. "You are bringing that child into this house?" he asked, his tone low but firm, not waiting for confirmation. Beside me, my mother remained silent, her hands resting on the edge of the counter, her eyes moving between me and my father as if trying to measure which side of the conversation would survive the morning. The child in question, a small boy named Noah, was sitting quietly in the next room. It was 5 years old, and he had not spoken a single word since I met him 3 months earlier at the foster care center. The doctors called it selective mutism, a condition tied to trauma, but to me, it had never felt like something broken. It felt like silence that had learned to protect itself. When I first met him, he had simply looked at me for a long time without speaking, and somehow that silence had felt more honest than anything I had heard in years. That was the moment I decided I would adopt him, even though I knew exactly how my family would react. And now I was standing in the middle of that reaction. "He needs stability," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. "He does not need another system that treats him like a problem to be fixed." My father let out a short, disapproving breath, shaking his head slightly as if the conversation itself was already exhausting him. "You are not thinking clearly," he replied. "You are 29 years old, Claire. You do not build a life around uncertainty like that." His words were not shouted, but they carried the weight of authority that did not require volume. He glanced toward the living room where Noah was sitting on the floor with a small toy car in his hands, quietly turning it back and forth without making a sound. He did not look up. He rarely did in unfamiliar spaces. But I could feel his awareness of tension even without words. That was something I had learned quickly about him. He did not need speech to understand emotion. My father stepped closer to the table, placing one hand on the wood surface as if anchoring his position in the conversation. "You will not bring that child into this family as if this is normal," he said. There was no hesitation in his voice now. Only finality. My chest tightened slightly, but I forced myself to remain still. He had expected disagreement. He had expected resistance. What I had not fully prepared for was the speed at which disagreement turned into rejection. My mother finally spoke, softly, but without stepping into either side. "Claire, maybe you should reconsider timing," she said, though her eyes avoided mine as she spoke. "You mean?" As if this was a scheduling issue rather than a human decision. He looked back at my father, waiting for even a moment of reconsideration, but his expression remained unchanged. It was then that I realized this was no longer a discussion. It was an evaluation. And I was already failing it in his eyes. The silence that followed my father's words did not feel like an absence of sound, but rather like a space that had been intentionally cleared of any possibility of disagreement. He stood in the same position near the kitchen counter, still holding the folder of adoption documents, though I was no longer looking at them. My attention had shifted entirely to the dynamics unfolding between the three of us, or more accurately, the lack of any real space for my perspective to exist within those dynamics. My father remained standing near the table, his posture unchanged, his presence steady in the way that suggested he did not expect the conversation to continue beyond his last statement. My mother, still near the counter, looked down briefly before turning her gaze toward the living room, where Noah remained quietly seated on the floor. It was still holding his small toy car, moving it slowly back and forth, absorbed in a world that did not require him to explain himself in order to exist within it. He noticed how different his silence felt compared to the silence in the room. His silence was natural, unforced, and self-contained. The silence between my parents and me felt structured, almost instructional, as if it was meant to guide me toward a conclusion without further dialogue. You are asking me to choose between family stability and a situation you cannot fully predict, my father said after a moment, his tone slightly lower now, but still controlled. That is not a reasonable position to take. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my thoughts before responding. I am not choosing unpredictability, I said. I am choosing a child who has already been through instability. That is not the same thing. My words did not raise tension in the room so much as they seemed to settle differently, like they had landed in a place where they were not expected to have weight. My mother finally stepped slightly closer to the counter, her voice soft but careful. Clyde, this is not about emotion alone, she said. This is about structure. About responsibility. About what kind of environment you are building. He turned slightly toward her, recognizing that she was attempting to frame the situation in a way that sounded rational, but still excluded the emotional reality of the decision I had already made. He is not an environment, I replied quietly. He is a child. There was a brief pause after that, longer than the previous silences. My father's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to disappointment that had already settled into certainty. You are not prepared for what you are committing to, he said. And I will not support a decision that destabilizes your future. They. Phrase will not support carried a weight that felt final, not because it was dramatic, but because it was absolute. He glanced again toward the living room. Noah had not moved. It had not reacted to any of the conversation. But something about the stillness in his posture made me aware that even without words, he was sensing the shift in energy. He realized then that this was not just a disagreement about adoption. It was a boundary being enforced through emotional withdrawal rather than physical action. My father was not arguing for understanding. It was defining limits. And I was already standing outside of them. He lowered the folder slightly, no longer holding it as tightly as before. So what exactly are you saying? I asked carefully, though I already understood the direction of the answer. My father met my eyes directly for the first time since the conversation began. I am saying, he replied, that if you proceed with this, you are doing so without my approval, and without this Famyly's acceptance of the consequences. The words were delivered without hesitation. No raised voice. No visible conflict. Used structure being declared as final. In that moment, I understood that what I had thought was a conversation about choice had already become a conversation about separation. The words my father had just spoken did not create immediate chaos in the room, but instead settled into it like something already accepted long before it was verbalized. He remained standing near the kitchen counter, still holding the folder, though my grip had loosened without me consciously realizing it. The structure of the conversation had shifted, and with it, my understanding of what I was actually participating in. This was no longer a discussion about whether I should adopt Noah. It had become a declaration of conditions under which I would no longer be considered aligned with my Famyly's expectations. My mother was the first to break the silence, though her voice remained measured, careful, as if she was attempting to soften something that had already hardened. Clyde, she said, your father is trying to make you understand the seriousness of this decision. He turned. Thou wart her slowly. I understand it, I replied. I understand exactly what he is saying. My father exhaled slightly, shifting his stance but not his position. Then you also understand the consequences, he added. He did not respond immediately, because in that moment I realized that the conversation was no longer about persuasion. It was about alignment. Whether I would remain inside a system that required agreement in order to remain connected. My eyes drifted again toward the living room. Noah was still there, and Chang, still quietly moving the small toy car in a slow repetitive motion. It was not reacting to anything being said, but I had begun to realize that his silence was not absence. It was a form of presence that did not depend on participation in verbal exchange. That contrast between his silence and the silence in the kitchen made everything else feel sharper. My father took a step back from the table, his tone now fully settled into finality. If you proceed, he said, you are choosing a path that does not include this household as your support structure. There was no emotional escalation in his voice. No visible anger. Only clarity. And that clarity was what made it feel irreversible. I placed the folder down on the counter carefully, not as an act of defiance, but as a way of grounding myself in something physical while the conversation reached its final form. I am not asking you to agree with me, I said quietly. I am telling you that I am going through with the adoption. My mother closed her eyes briefly, as if absorbing the weight of what had just been confirmed. When she opened them again, her expression was more distant than before. Then you will have to accept that things will change, she said. He nodded slightly, though I did not look away from her. I already understand that, I replied. My father did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Then this conversation is finished, he said. The sentence did not feel like an ending in the emotional sense. It felt procedural, like a boundary had been finalized and recorded without further need for input. He looked at both of them for a moment longer, recognizing that nothing I could say would alter what had already been decided in their framework of understanding. Then I turned slightly toward the living room again. Noah was still there, still silent, still unaware of the full structure of the world around him being reorganized in real time because of his existence. He realized in that moment that I was not only choosing to adopt him. He was also stepping out of a structure that no longer had a place for both of us at once. The moment my father declared that the conversation was finished did not feel like an ending in the emotional sense, but rather like a structural closure that no longer required participation from both sides to remain valid. He remained standing in the kitchen for a few seconds longer, not because I expected anything to change, but because I was trying to understand the full shape of what had just happened. My mother had already turned slightly away, her attention shifting toward routine tasks in the room, as if the conversation had been folded back into the normal rhythm of the household. My father stood near the table, no longer engaged in explanation, his posture relaxed in the way it becomes when authority no longer needs to be defended. The silence between us was no longer tense. It was finalized. He slowly moved away from the counter and toward the living room, my steps measured, not hurried, as if any sudden movement would disrupt something already sealed in place. Noah was still sitting in the same position on the floor, quietly focused on the toy car in his hands. His world had not changed during the conversation, even though mine had shifted completely. He sat down near him, not immediately speaking, simply lowering myself to his level so that I was no longer separated by distance or structure. He did not look up, but he did not move away either. That small continuity of presence felt more grounding than anything that had been said in the kitchen. For a moment, I simply watched him, observing the rhythm of his quiet repetition, the way he turned the car slowly back and forth as if it was the only predictable element in the environment. He realized then that his silence had never been empty. It was structured differently. It did not react to pressure, approval, or rejection. It existed independently of those systems. My father's decision, my mother's hesitation, the finality of their words, all of it still existed behind me in the kitchen, but it no longer felt like it defined the space I was in at that moment. He reached out slowly and placed my hand on the floor beside Noah, not touching him directly at first, simply sharing space without demand. After a few seconds, he shifted slightly closer to me, still not speaking, still not looking up, but adjusting his position in a way that acknowledged presence without requiring language. That small movement carried more weight than anything that had been said earlier in the day. It confirmed something I had begun to understand but had not yet fully accepted. The system I had been arguing within upstairs was not designed to include this kind of connection. It required clarity, definition, and agreement to function. But what I was experiencing now with Noah existed outside of that requirement. I leaned back slightly, resting my hands on the floor behind me, allowing myself to fully sit in the quiet with him. The house behind us continued its normal sounds, faint movement, distant conversation, the settling of a meal that had already reached its conclusion. But none of it felt directed toward us anymore. I thought about my father's final words, about the idea that I was stepping outside of a structure that would no longer support me. At the time, it had felt like a loss. Now, sitting in the quiet with Noah, I began to understand it differently. It was not simply removal. It was repositioning. I looked at him again, noticing how calm he remained, unaffected by the emotional structure surrounding him. I did not need to understand the conversation in order to exist within its aftermath. That realization settled slowly but firmly in my thoughts. He was no longer standing at the edge of a system trying to be included. He was already outside of it, sitting in a space that had no defined expectations for who I should be. And in that space, for the first time that day, there was no pressure to explain my presence in order for it to be valid. The hours after the conversation settled into a quiet that felt different from the silence that had filled the kitchen earlier. That earlier silence had been structured, defined by unspoken expectations and emotional boundaries that determined who belonged within the conversation and who did not. This silence, however, felt open. It did not carry instruction or judgment. It simply existed. He remained seated on the floor of the living room beside Noah, not forcing interaction, not attempting to fill the space with explanation. He continued to hold the small toy car, turning it slowly in his hands, his attention fixed on something that did not require approval or understanding from anyone else. He began to notice how naturally he remained present without needing confirmation that he was allowed to be there. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. In the kitchen, every presence had been defined by role, expectation, and response. Here, there was no structure enforcing participation, yet presence still existed in a quieter, more stable form. He leaned slightly forward, resting my arms on my knees, watching him for a few moments without speaking. The idea that had been forming earlier, the idea that I had stepped outside of a system that required alignment to function, now felt less like a consequence and more like a shift in perspective. It was not that I had lost something in the kitchen. It was that I had entered a different kind of space where belonging was not conditional on agreement. Noah shifted slightly closer again without looking at me, a small movement that was not prompted by instruction or expectation. It was simply proximity. That small adjustment felt significant in a way that was difficult to articulate. There was no negotiation behind it, no evaluation of whether it was acceptable. It just happened. He realized I had spent most of the earlier conversation trying to justify a decision that, in this moment, no longer required justification in order to exist. The adoption papers were still upstairs on the counter, but they felt less like a point of conflict now and more like a formality attached to something I had already decided. In a different layer of understanding. He thought about my father's final words again, the idea that I had chosen a path without their support. At the time, it had felt like a boundary being placed around me. Now, sitting here in this quiet room, it felt more like a boundary I had stepped beyond rather than been pushed out of. The difference was subtle but important. One implied exclusion. The other implied movement. Noah finally glanced up briefly, not fully meeting my eyes, but acknowledging presence in a way that was fleeting and natural. He did not try to extend the moment. He simply nodded slightly, not as instruction, but as recognition. There was no need to interpret his silence as absence or deficiency. It existed on its own terms, just as the space between us did. The house around us remained active in the background, faint sounds of movement and distant conversation continuing in patterns that no longer included us in any structured way. But that separation did not feel isolating anymore. It felt clarifying. He understood now that the conversation upstairs had been about alignment within a defined system, while what was happening here required no such alignment to remain intact. He stayed seated with Noah as the evening continued, not attempting to re-enter the structure that had defined the earlier part of the day. Instead, I observed the simplicity of being present without negotiation, without hierarchy, and without the need to be assigned a place in order to occupy it. And in that quiet understanding, I realized that what had been framed as loss was actually the beginning of a different kind of stability, one that did not depend on approval to continue existing. The evening had fully transitioned into a quieter phase, where the household no longer felt like it was in motion but instead in a slow settling state, as if the events of the day were gradually finding their final resting positions. He remained seated on the living room floor beside Noah, who had not moved far from where he had been before, still quietly engaged with the small toy car in his hands. The rhythm of his movements was steady, almost meditative in its simplicity. He found myself matching that stillness without consciously deciding to, as if the absence of external pressure had naturally removed the need for constant internal justification. The house beyond the living room continued to produce faint sounds of closure, chairs shifting, distant footsteps, and the soft transitions of a gathering reaching its end. But none of those sounds required my participation anymore. He became aware that I was no longer anticipating re-entry into the kitchen or any continuation of the earlier conversation. That moment had already passed into a different category of experience, one that no longer demanded resolution. He looked at Noah again, noticing how he remained entirely unaffected by the emotional structure that had defined the earlier part of the day. There was no trace of confusion in him, no awareness of the formal decisions that had been made upstairs. He existed entirely within the present moment, without needing to interpret it through approval or rejection. That quality of presence felt unfamiliar to me in a way that was slowly becoming clearer rather than overwhelming. He realized I had spent most of the day operating within a system where meaning was assigned externally, where every action and decision required validation or response from others in order to feel complete. Here, in contrast, there was no such requirement. He shifted slightly, resting my back more comfortably against the wall behind me, allowing myself to remain still without evaluating whether that stillness was acceptable. Noah briefly adjusted his position closer to me again, not in search of attention, but as a natural continuation of proximity. He did not interpret it as a request or expectation. It simply existed, and I allowed it to remain as it was. My thoughts drifted briefly back to my father's final words earlier in the day, the idea that I had chosen a path outside of their acceptance. At the time, it had carried the weight of separation. But no, the concept of separation itself felt less absolute. It no longer felt like being cut off from something essential, but rather stepping into a space that operated under different conditions entirely. He noticed how that shift in perspective did not erase the past conversation, but it changed its significance. What had once felt like a judgment now felt more like a definition of boundaries I had already begun to cross before they were formally stated. The adoption papers remained somewhere upstairs, still physically present in the house, but they no longer felt like a point of tension between competing realities. Instead, they felt like documentation of a decision that had already taken shape internally, independent of approval. I glanced again at Noah, who continued his quiet repetitive movement with the toy car, unaffected by the complexity of meaning surrounding him. There was something grounding in that simplicity, not because it offered answers, but because it did not require questions in order to remain valid. He began to understand that the shift I was experiencing was not about rejecting one system for another, but about recognizing that not all forms of connection operate under the same rules. The earlier structure of family expectation, approval, and defined roles still existed in principle, but it no longer extended into this space with authority. Here, presence was not assigned. It simply was. He remained sitting with him as the evening continued to settle, not waiting for anything to resolve, not anticipating correction or re-entry, but observing the quiet continuity of a moment that no longer required validation in order to continue existing. The night had deepened further, and the house had fully settled into a quiet state that felt separate from the earlier emotional intensity of the day. He remained seated on the living room floor beside Noah, who had gradually slowed his movement with the toy car until it became almost still in his hands. The absence of noise from the rest of the house made the space around us feel more contained, as if the boundaries of this moment had become clearer now that everything else had stepped back. He noticed that I was no longer thinking about what had been said upstairs in active terms. The conversation with my father no longer replayed itself with urgency or emotional charge. Instead, it felt like something recorded and placed. Aside, no longer requiring immediate processing. Noah shifted slightly, leaning closer to me without looking up, his presence steady and unforced. He did not interpret it as communication in the traditional sense. It was simply continuity. And that continuity felt increasingly important in a way I was only beginning to understand. He thought about how earlier in the day, every interaction had been defined by evaluation. Each sentence had carried weight not just in meaning but in consequence. Approval or disapproval had shaped the direction of everything that followed. Back here, none of that structure existed. There was no evaluation occurring in real time. There was only presence. I leaned my head back slightly against the wall, allowing myself to remain still without scanning for responses or outcomes. The stillness no longer felt like absence of activity. It felt like a different kind of organization, one that did not require external validation to maintain coherence. Noah's small hand adjusted the toy car again, tracing the same slow motion across his lap. He watched him for a moment and realized that his consistency was not a withdrawal from interaction, but a form of stability that did not depend on explanation. That realization began to shift something in my perspective. He had spent much of my life interpreting connection through responsiveness, through spoken agreement and visible acknowledgement. But sitting here, I began to see that not all connection operates through those channels. Some forms of connection exist through shared space without exchange. I became aware of how the earlier conversation with my parents had defined connection as conditional. Belonging had been framed as something that required alignment, agreement, and acceptance of structure. Yet in this room, none of those conditions were active, and yet presence still existed. It was not absent. It was simply unregulated by the system I had been part of earlier. He looked toward the hallway briefly, noticing the faint light still coming from the kitchen area, now dimmer, as if the house itself had shifted into a lower state of engagement. That separation between spaces felt more symbolic than physical now. Upstairs represented structure, expectation, and defined roles. This space represented continuity without definition. Noah leaned slightly closer again, and this time I placed my hand gently on the floor near his, not touching him directly but allowing proximity without intention. He did not react, and I did not expect him to. The absence of reaction no longer felt like distance. It felt like neutrality that did not require interpretation. He began to understand that what had been labeled earlier in the day as exclusion was, in this moment, revealing itself as something more complex. It was not simply being removed from a system. It was the recognition that not all systems are required for all forms of existence. He stayed there for a long time without moving, allowing the silence to continue without trying to assign meaning to it. And in that extended quiet, I realized that the structure I had been resisting earlier was not the only framework available for connection. There were other forms, quieter and less defined, but no less real in their presence. The house had fully transitioned into the deep quiet of late evening, where even the smallest sounds felt distant and softened, as if the environment itself had reduced its intensity to allow everything that had happened earlier in the day to settle into place. He remained seated on the living room floor beside Noah, who had now completely slowed his movements, resting the toy car loosely in his hands without actively pushing it back and forth. The stillness between us no longer felt unusual or temporary. It felt established, as if it had become the default state of this space rather than a reaction to anything external. He noticed that my awareness of the rest of the house had shifted significantly. The kitchen, where the earlier conversation had taken place, no longer felt emotionally active in my perception. It existed more as a distant reference point than an immediate presence. My thoughts were no longer circling the words my father had spoken or the finality in his tone. Instead, they had begun to settle into something more observational, as if I were reviewing an event that had already completed its function. Noah shifted slightly, adjusting his posture so that his shoulder lightly leaned closer to my leg. It was not a request or a signal. It was simply movement within shared space. He did not interpret it as communication that required response. He simply acknowledged it internally as continuity. That distinction had started to matter more than I expected. Earlier in the day, every interaction had carried implicit demands for interpretation, agreement, or reaction. Now, there was no such demand. He realized I was no longer tracking approval or disapproval in real time. That system of evaluation had effectively stopped operating in this space. He turned my head slightly and looked toward the hallway again, noticing how the faint light from the kitchen no longer felt connected to us in any meaningful way. It was still part of the same house, but it no longer felt like part of the same structure of experience. The separation between what had happened upstairs and what was happening here was no longer emotional. It felt functional, almost architectural. Two different systems operating within the same physical environment without overlapping requirements. He lowered my gaze back to Noah, who remained calm and unresponsive in the way that had initially seemed like absence but now felt more like stability without explanation. He began to understand that his silence was not something that needed interpretation in order to be valid. It was self-contained. It did not depend on feedback loops of approval or correction. That realization continued to reshape how I was understanding everything that had occurred earlier in the day. The adoption decision, the conversation with my father, the withdrawal of support, all of it had been framed within a system that required alignment in order to function. But sitting here now, I could see that there were forms of connection that did not require alignment at all in order to exist. He shifted slightly, adjusting my position against the wall, allowing myself to remain fully still without anticipating what might come next or how this moment should progress. Noah's hand moved slightly again, resting more comfortably on his lap, still holding the toy cat. I did not reach for it or redirect his attention. There was no need for direction in this space. The absence of instruction did not create confusion here. It created continuity. He thought briefly about my parents upstairs, about the structure that had defined my place within the family for so long, and how quickly that structure had been declared closed once I stepped outside its expectations. But that closure no longer felt like a rupture. It felt like a boundary that had revealed itself clearly enough for me to recognize where one system ended and another began. He remained there in the quiet with Noah, not attempting to reconcile the two spaces in my mind anymore. Instead, I allowed them to exist separately, understanding that not all forms of belonging are meant to operate under the same conditions. And in that understanding, the silence around me no longer felt like absence of inclusion. It felt like a different kind of inclusion entirely, one that did not require permission to continue. The night had reached a point of stillness where the entire house felt suspended in a quiet state that no longer carried tension or anticipation. He remained seated on the living room floor beside Noah, who had now fully settled into a calm stillness, the small toy car resting loosely in his hands without movement. The absence of motion did not feel like inactivity, but rather like completion of a cycle that did not require continuation. I found myself matching that stillness without effort, no longer scanning the environment for changes or waiting for the next shift in emotional tone. The kitchen remained distant, both physically and psychologically, as if it belonged to a different layer of time that had already finished its function. I thought about the events of the day, not as a sequence of arguments or decisions, but as a progression of structural changes in how I was understood within my family. The conversation with my father no longer felt like something that could be revisited or revised. It had reached its final form earlier in the day, and everything after it had simply confirmed its permanence. Noah shifted slightly again, this time leaning his head gently against my leg without any hesitation or acknowledgement of what it might mean. He did not interpret it as need or request. He understood it instead as presence without condition. That distinction had become increasingly clear the longer I remained in this space with him. Earlier, I had believed that belonging required recognition, that connection required acknowledgement from both sides in order to exist. But sitting here now, I could see that some forms of connection were not constructed through agreement. They were constructed through continuity of shared space without negotiation. I looked down at him, noticing how his stillness remained consistent, unaffected by the absence of verbal structure or external validation. There was no expectation in his posture, no anticipation of response. It simply existed in proximity, and that existence felt complete in a way I had not fully understood before. My thoughts briefly returned to the earlier moment in the kitchen, to the finality in my father's voice, and the way the conversation had closed without reopening. At the time, it had felt like separation. But now, that separation felt less like a rupture and more like a redefinition of boundaries between systems that did not function under the same conditions. He realized that I was no longer trying to reconcile those systems in my mind. The need to justify my decision, to defend my position within the family structure, had gradually faded as the day progressed. It had been replaced by a quieter recognition that not all forms of belonging are dependent on inclusion within a single framework. He adjusted my position slightly against the wall, allowing myself to remain fully still without expectation of what should follow next. The house remained quiet around us, not empty, but settled. He thought about how quickly meaning had shifted throughout the day, how something that began as a confrontation over adoption had evolved into a deeper understanding of how different forms of connection operate independently of approval or agreement. My father's rejection had once felt like a definitive loss, but now it existed as part of a structure I had stepped out of rather than something that had collapsed around me. Noah's hand moved slightly, resting more comfortably against his lap again. Still holding the toy cat, I did not move to change his position or guide his attention. There was no requirement to correct or interpret his behavior here. That absence of requirement felt significant. It allowed both of us to exist without translation. As I sat there, I realized that what had changed was not only my relationship with my family, but my understanding of what it meant to be included at all. Inclusión, as I had once understood it, required alignment, agreement, and recognition. But here, in this quiet space with Noah, inclusion existed without those conditions. It existed simply through shared presence that did not require validation to continue. And in that realization, I understood that I was no longer standing at the edge of a system that had rejected me. He was already within a different form of connection entirely, one that did not require permission to remain real.